June 22, 1941. At precisely 3:15 in the morning, the thunder of artillery shook the skies along a front stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea. Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in human history, had begun. Over 3 million German soldiers, supported by 500,000 troops from Axis allies, poured into Soviet territory in 3 massive army groups. For the men of the Wehrmacht, confidence radiated from every column of tanks and every squad of infantry. They had conquered Poland in weeks, swept through France in mere months, and driven the British off the continent. The Soviet Union, in their eyes, would collapse just as easily. The German rank and file laughed at the idea of backward Russians. Nazi propaganda had primed them with images of illiterate peasants armed with rusty rifles. The High Command promised a campaign of only 3 months. One soldier of the 18th Army scribbled in his diary on that first day, "We are racing eastward. By winter this Bolshevik land will be finished." Blitzkrieg, the storm of tanks and planes, seemed unstoppable. But as the dust rose on those first days of battle, the Germans began encountering an enemy that refused to die neatly. The Red Army was chaotic, poorly organized, and suffering catastrophic losses, but it was not broken. At Minsk, Smolensk, and Kiev, Soviet divisions were encircled, hundreds of thousands captured. Yet even as columns of prisoners marched westward, other Soviet formations emerged from forests, villages, and rivers, striking back with desperate ferocity. And among those defenders, to the astonishment of the German invaders, were women. At first, German soldiers hardly believed their eyes. A platoon advancing through a Ukrainian village in July reported being fired upon by a sniper hidden in a bell tower. When the body was dragged down, it was not a man, but a girl, scarcely 20 years old, still in a patched Red Army uniform. In the chaos of retreat, the Soviets had begun pressing women into frontline service, not merely as nurses or clerks, but as rifle-bearers. To the Wehrmacht infantrymen, who came from a culture where women were never expected to fight, it was both bewildering and insulting. They joked about it in their letters home, until more such encounters piled up. The first weeks of Barbarossa became a blur of heat, dust, and endless marches. German divisions pressed deeper, confident the campaign was proceeding as planned. Yet rumours spread along the lines. The Ivans are sending their women to fight. At first it was dismissed as Soviet desperation, a sign that the Red Army was scraping the bottom of the barrel. But as German officers compiled after-action reports, they noticed that these girls with rifles were not merely symbolic. They could shoot, and they could kill. Still, the early summer of 1941 was a time of catastrophe for the Soviet Union. Stalin's purges of the officer corps had crippled command structures. Aircraft were destroyed by the thousands on the ground. Entire armies vanished in the German tide. But amid the wreckage, the seeds of resistance were taking root. Women, who had already filled Soviet factories and fields during the industrial push of the 1930s, now found themselves filling the ranks of the Red Army. Some enlisted out of patriotism, others out of vengeance after seeing their homes burned and families executed. In July, German patrols near Smolensk reported repeated harassment from lone rifle shots echoing from the woods. A Feldwebel of the 10th Panzer Division recorded that one of his men was struck cleanly through the helmet while standing no more than a moment exposed. When they scoured the area, they found a carefully concealed hide. The footprints left behind were small, like a child's. To the German NCO, it was unthinkable. A female sniper had stalked them with the skill of a hunter. By August, these encounters multiplied. At Kiev, during the bitter fighting along the Dnieper, German marksmen dueling Soviet sharpshooters reported that some of their adversaries were women. One captured Red Army file noted entire sniper detachments being formed from Komsomol girls, university students, factory workers, even school teachers. Their rifles were the standard Mosin Nagant 9130, fitted with PU scopes, deadly accurate in the right hands. For the Germans, who prided themselves on their Jaegers and elite riflemen, it was disorienting. These women not only fought, but fought with unnerving patience. A corporal of the Sixth Army later told interrogators that his men had begun to fear the invisible girls in the trees. They laughed no longer. And yet, in 1941, this was only the beginning. Most of these women were scattered volunteers, fighting without central coordination. They were outnumbered and often killed quickly in the savage retreats. But the impression they left was undeniable. Even in those dark months when Soviet armies bled and cities fell, word spread back to Moscow. Women could fight, and in the sniper's art they could excel. As the Germans drove toward Moscow in the autumn of 1941, they carried with them the arrogance of victors. They still believed the Soviet Union would collapse before winter, but in the ruined villages, in the forests, and on the edges of burning cities, a different truth was unfolding. The first generation of Soviet women snipers was already leaving its mark, and soon their ranks would swell into thousands. By the time the snows fell, German soldiers who once sneered at peasant girls with rifles would whisper warnings to new replacements. "Don't show your head above the trench line. The Russians have women snipers, and they shoot straighter than the men." The shock of invasion had begun to wear off, replaced by the first hints of dread. What had seemed a war of tanks and bombers was becoming, in shattered streets and frozen forests, a war of patience, stealth, and the unseen crosshairs of a rifle. And to the Germans' disbelief, some of the deadliest eyes behind those scopes belonged not to hardened Soviet men, but to women, young, determined, and merciless. This was the birth of a legend the Germans never expected, and in the years to come, those women would outshoot even the Reich's finest marksmen. The autumn of 1941 brought Moscow to the brink of disaster. German panzers rolled ever closer, the Luftwaffe prowled the skies, and millions of Soviet soldiers lay dead or captured. The Red Army, battered yet unbroken, faced a grim reality. To survive, it would need to mobilize every resource, every factory, every village, every citizen. That meant women. The Soviet Union already had a long tradition of women working in heavy industry, agriculture, and medicine, but frontline combat had been another matter. As the Wehrmacht closed in on Moscow, Stalin and his generals understood they had no choice. By late 1941, women were being admitted not only as nurses and clerks, but as pilots, tank crews, and snipers. The sniper's art suited them uniquely well. It required not brute strength, but patience, endurance, and nerves of steel. The Soviet leadership recognized that women could excel in this field, and in 1942 they formalized what desperation had already begun in the field: the training of women as professional snipers. Near Moscow, the Central Women's Sniper Training School was established under the Red Army. Thousands of young women, many still in their teens, volunteered. Some were Komsomol members, stirred by propaganda posters of rifles and bayonets. Others carried more personal reasons, avenging brothers, fathers, and lovers killed in the first months of the invasion. Training was rigorous and merciless. Recruits drilled endlessly on the Mosin Nagant 9130 rifle, the standard Soviet sniper's weapon. Fitted with a 3.5 times PU scope, it was simple, reliable, and deadly accurate up to 800 meters. But marksmanship was only part of the craft. Women were taught camouflage to perfection. They learned to move like shadows, to crawl across frozen ground for hours without making a sound, to remain motionless even as insects bit their skin or artillery shells burst nearby. Instructors forced them to dig hides in snowbanks, disguise themselves as tree stumps, and wait 2 days without moving to simulate a real mission. Equally important was the mental war. Snipers were not ordinary riflemen, they were hunters. Their job was not to spray bullets, but to choose a single target, stalk them, and kill with precision. This demanded patience, cold calculation, and psychological resilience. A sniper must become invisible, one instructor told a graduating class in 1942. She must vanish into the earth, into the grass, into the city ruins. She must be everywhere and nowhere. Out of this crucible came some of the most feared names on the Eastern Front. Foremost was Lyudmila Pavlichenko, a history student from Kiev who enlisted at 24 and quickly distinguished herself. By the end of her service, she had 309 confirmed kills, including 36 enemy snipers. Her reputation spread so widely that the Germans broadcast radio messages appealing to her by name, offering her rewards if she defected, and threatening to tear her apart if captured. Then came Rosa Shanina, a young woman from Arkhangelsk who joined in 1943. Described as quiet and bookish, she became lethal on the front lines of Belarus, scoring 59 confirmed kills before being killed in East Prussia in 1945. She kept a diary that revealed her duality, a compassionate young woman who also believed it was her duty to destroy as many invaders as possible. There was also Nina Lobkovskaya, who lost her father early in the war and later commanded an all-female sniper platoon. Under her leadership, women hunted German officers across the ruins of Stalingrad and later the streets of Berlin. Each of these women represented something larger than themselves. To the Soviet state, they became symbols of resilience. Women of the people, ordinary citizens who picked up rifles and turned the invader's arrogance back on him. German reports at the time noted this strange development with disbelief. Captured diaries reveal that Wehrmacht soldiers could scarcely understand what they were facing. "It is dishonourable," wrote one German corporal in 1942, "to be shot by a girl. And yet it happens too often. They are not human. These Russian women are demons with rifles." Soviet propaganda, keen to weaponize this, plastered posters with slogans like "Sisters of the People's Vengeance" and "Every German shall have his bullet." Photographs of young women in padded jackets with rifles slung over their shoulders circulated in newspapers. Far from being ridiculed, these images inspired both fear in Germans and pride in Soviets. The numbers were staggering. By the end of the war, more than 2,000 trained female snipers would serve in the Red Army. Their combined tally exceeded 12,000 confirmed kills. The attrition was brutal, only about 500 of them survived the war, but their impact was undeniable. And yet in 1942, this was still the beginning. The German advance had been checked at Moscow, but the tide was far from turned. As the front settled into sieges and brutal city battles, women snipers would soon find their deadliest proving ground in the shattered ruins of Stalingrad. For the German soldiers, the idea still seemed absurd. Soviet women, delicate and small, outshooting trained marksmen of the Reich? They dismissed it as a trick, or luck, or an act of desperation. But soon those same soldiers would peer over a broken wall, only to feel the invisible crosshairs settle upon them. What had begun as a desperate experiment was becoming a strategic weapon. The women snipers of the Red Army were ready to step into history, not as anomalies, but as hunters who would forever alter the psychology of the Eastern Front. By the summer of 1941, the southern fronts of the Soviet Union were collapsing under the German advance. Odessa, a strategic Black Sea port, became one of the first great battlegrounds of resistance. Among the thousands of soldiers sent to defend the city was a 24-year-old university student from Kiev who had traded her textbooks for a rifle, Lyudmila Pavlichenko. At first glance, Pavlichenko did not fit the image of a warrior. She had been studying history at Kiev University, dreamed of teaching, and loved books more than bullets. But when Hitler's invasion shattered the Soviet Union, she volunteered for the Red Army. At the enlistment office, she insisted on being sent to the front as a combat soldier. The recruiters laughed, offering her a role as a nurse. She refused. Only when she produced a marksman's certificate, earned in civilian shooting clubs before the war, did they hand her a Mosin Nagant and send her into the inferno. It was in the trenches outside Odessa that Pavlichenko drew her first blood. The Germans were pressing hard, probing Soviet defences with infantry patrols and machine gun nests. She recalled in later interviews that her first kill was the hardest. A young German soldier broke from cover, and she squeezed the trigger. He fell. "I had to take my rifle and prove I could shoot," she remembered. "My first battle ended with my first 2 kills. That was the moment when I realized that a real war was going on. From that day forward, her tally climbed with ruthless speed. She learned to choose her targets carefully: enemy scouts, machine gunners, officers. Each bullet was meant to weaken German momentum, to disrupt command and sow fear. Within weeks, she was a known figure in her unit. By the time Odessa fell in October 1941 and Soviet forces retreated to Sevastopol, Pavlichenko had already scored over 100 confirmed kills. Sevastopol became her true crucible. The port city, perched on the Crimean peninsula, turned into a fortress under siege. For 8 months in 1941–42, the Red Army clung to its defences against repeated German assaults. Snipers became crucial in this battle of attrition, and Pavlichenko emerged as one of the deadliest. Her camouflage skills allowed her to slip into no man's land, lie buried in the earth for hours, and strike unseen. Her reputation spread quickly, not only among her comrades but among the Germans. Reports filtered through Wehrmacht intelligence channels. "Beware the woman sniper in Sevastopol." German units began taking extraordinary precautions, posting lookouts, and even organising special hunts to track her down. But she seemed untouchable. One of Pavlichenko's most famous duels took place during this siege. A German sniper had been killing Soviet officers near the front. Pavlichenko was tasked with eliminating him. For 3 days, the 2 hunters stalked each other across the ruins. She studied the terrain, noted every flash of his scope, every hint of movement. Finally, she spotted his mistake, a glint of metal where his rifle barrel caught the sun. 1 shot, and the duel was over. She crawled forward and confirmed the kill, an experienced German marksman who had claimed dozens of Soviet lives. By the spring of 1942, her tally had reached staggering numbers. Soviet records credited her with more than 300 confirmed kills, including 36 enemy snipers. These were not inflated propaganda figures alone. Her logbook was meticulously maintained, with witnesses confirming each strike. Her presence alone boosted morale. Soldiers whispered that if Pavlichenko was on the line, no German could feel safe. The Germans responded in an unusual way. They tried to break her spirit. Broadcasts across the front line, using loudspeakers and leaflets, called her out by name. "Lyudmila Pavlichenko," one German message taunted. "Come over to us. We will give you chocolate and make you an officer." When that failed, the tone turned darker. "If we catch you, we will tear you into 309 pieces for your 309 kills." Far from intimidating her, these threats only confirmed her effectiveness. To the German infantrymen facing her, it was deeply unsettling. Diaries recovered after the battle reveal the unease. "It is shameful to be hunted like animals by a woman, but she does not miss. They say she sees everything." The humiliation of being outshot by a female sniper gnawed at German pride. Meanwhile, to the Soviets, Pavlichenko became a symbol of national resilience. Newspapers ran stories of her exploits. Photographs of her in a padded jacket, rifle across her lap, circulated widely. She embodied the new role of Soviet women, not only workers and mothers, but avengers. "Every German shall have his bullet," one Pravda article declared beside her portrait. Yet behind the image of the huntress of Sevastopol was still a young woman enduring horrors. She saw friends and comrades killed daily. She crawled through mud and blood, waited in silence while artillery flattened the earth around her, and bore the crushing exhaustion of days without sleep. But she never faltered. Each confirmed kill was not only a number but a small act of revenge for the devastation the Germans had unleashed upon her homeland. Sevastopol eventually fell in July 1942 after months of brutal siege. Pavlichenko herself was wounded by mortar fire and evacuated by submarine across the Black Sea. She had survived one of the most hellish battles of the war and emerged as the most famous female sniper in history. By then, her official tally stood at 309 confirmed kills. Her fame carried her beyond the battlefield. Later that year, she was sent abroad as part of a Soviet goodwill mission, visiting the United States, Canada, and Britain. There, she stunned audiences with her calm presence and her record. In Washington, she met Eleanor Roosevelt, who described her as a quiet, soft-spoken girl who bore herself with great dignity. American reporters, at first skeptical, were silenced when she matter-of-factly stated her kill count. "Gentlemen," she told them, "I am 25 years old, and I have killed 309 fascist invaders. Do you not think you have been hiding behind my back too long?" But before she became a global icon, she had already proven on the battlefields of Odessa and Sevastopol that the Germans' assumptions were false. They had marched into the Soviet Union convinced that women belonged in kitchens, not trenches. Pavlichenko shattered that illusion. She was not an anomaly. She was the vanguard of a new force that would haunt the Eastern Front for the rest of the war. For the Germans, the lesson was bitter. The Red Army's women were not symbolic. They were lethal. And if the most famous among them had already claimed hundreds of lives, how many more unseen huntresses were waiting, rifles steady, eyes fixed on the next target? By 1942, the myth of female weakness was dead. In its place stood Pavlichenko, and behind her, the rising ranks of Soviet women snipers who would carry the fight into the very heart of Stalingrad. In the summer of 1942, Hitler set his sights on the Volga. Stalingrad, a sprawling industrial city bearing the Soviet leader's name, became the new German objective. What began as another advance soon spiraled into one of the most savage battles in human history. For the Red Army, defending Stalingrad meant fighting not only for ground, but for survival itself. Amid the shattered factories and endless rubble, snipers, many of them women, found their perfect hunting ground. The city offered concealment like no battlefield before it. Collapsed buildings, burned-out factories, and sewer tunnels gave sharpshooters 1,000 places to hide. Every broken wall became a sniper's nest, every window an opportunity. For Soviet women who had trained in patience and camouflage, Stalingrad became their proving ground. German soldiers soon learned that the ruins were alive with invisible eyes. A squad moving across an open street might suddenly lose its sergeant to a single crack of a rifle. A machine gunner setting up in a window could be dead before pulling the trigger. At night, Soviet women crawled into the rubble and waited for hours, sometimes days, to strike a single target. The presence of women in this role unsettled the Germans deeply. To be outshot by a Soviet man was one thing. To be hunted by a young woman was a humiliation that gnawed at their pride. German diaries captured after the battle reveal the psychological toll. The Russians have women snipers. They do not miss. We are afraid to light a cigarette for fear they will see it. Among the women who fought in Stalingrad was Tanya Chernova, trained by Vasily Zaitsev, the famed sniper of the city. Chernova became part of Zaitsev's sniper school hidden within the ruins, where new recruits were taught to master the deadly art. Her missions targeted German officers specifically. By removing leaders, she sowed confusion among enemy ranks. Chernova herself recalled stalking a group of Germans through the ruins until she identified the lieutenant. She waited, breathing slow, until he exposed himself. One shot ended him, and the squad fell into disarray. Another was Nina Lobkovskaya, who would later command a sniper unit, but at Stalingrad began her career in the blood-soaked streets. Her platoon crawled into sewers, emerging behind German lines to strike at close range. In the chaos of urban combat, her patience and precision made her invaluable. Sniping in Stalingrad was not only about marksmanship, it was psychological warfare. The Germans, already stretched thin by house-to-house fighting, now faced an unseen enemy that could strike at any moment. A Wehrmacht veteran later admitted, "It was as though the very ruins themselves hated us. You felt eyes on you everywhere." The Soviet command understood this and encouraged the myth of the deadly huntresses. Newspapers back home ran stories of the girls of Stalingrad who defended the city with unerring aim. For the Red Army soldiers huddled in trenches, knowing women were killing Germans beside them was a source of pride and inspiration. One haunting tactic employed by the women was to leave the body of a shot German officer in the open. When comrades attempted to recover him, a second or third German would fall. The effect was chilling. No one wanted to move, and morale cracked under the invisible pressure. For the women themselves, it was grueling. They endured hunger, cold, and exhaustion. Sometimes they lay motionless for 2 days in a ruined building, unable to shift their weight lest the enemy see them. They fought not only the Germans but their own bodies, suppressing the urge to cough, to move, even to sleep. And yet, in those ruins, they excelled. Estimates suggest that during the Battle of Stalingrad alone, women snipers claimed hundreds of German lives. Each kill was logged, confirmed by spotters, and reported up the chain of command. For a war in which statistics often blurred truth and propaganda, the sniper's tally was one of the few measurable, undeniable realities. By the time the battle ended in February 1943 with the surrender of the German Sixth Army, the legend of Soviet women snipers was firmly established. They had not only matched, but in many cases outshot the Reich's best. German sniper units, once proud of their dueling skills, found themselves hunted by young women who proved just as cunning and far more patient. For the Germans, Stalingrad was the turning point of the war, a defeat from which their eastern campaign never recovered. For the Soviet women who had fought there, it was proof that they were not novelties or propaganda figures, but an integral part of the Red Army's arsenal. The city was left in ruins, but out of its ashes emerged a new reputation. The Soviet woman with a rifle was no longer a curiosity. She was a nightmare whispered about in German trenches, a force that even hardened veterans respected. Stalingrad had proven the point the Germans never expected. Soviet women snipers were not only capable, they were among the deadliest marksmen of the entire war. And as the Red Army pushed westward, these huntresses would carry their rifles into forests, villages and cities all the way to Berlin. By 1943, after Stalingrad's fall, the myth of the Soviet woman sniper was no longer confined to propaganda sheets. It was a bitter reality faced by German soldiers in every ruined street, every shattered tree line. The Wehrmacht and Waffen-SS could not ignore the psychological and tactical damage these women inflicted. The German High Command ordered countermeasures: deploy their best snipers, train new ones, and target Soviet women sharpshooters specifically. The duel between sniper and counter-sniper became one of the deadliest cat-and-mouse games of the Eastern Front. German snipers were trained professionals, many veterans of the Polish and French campaigns, schooled in camouflage, fieldcraft, and precision. Armed with their Mauser 98K rifles fitted with Zeiss optics, they believed they held the advantage in technology and experience. But against the Soviet women, those advantages often evaporated. Where German snipers relied on set doctrine, the Soviet women leaned on intuition, patience, and creativity. Many had grown up hunting in forests or fields, accustomed to waiting silently for hours. Others, trained through Soviet sniper schools, embraced camouflage so detailed it bordered on artistry: faces painted with soot, uniforms adapted to rubble, hair tucked under helmets to erase any sign of femininity. One of the most feared names to emerge during this period was Rosa Shanina. Born in Arkhangelsk in the far north, she had volunteered after her brother was killed in action. By 1944, she was already a legend within her unit, credited with dozens of confirmed kills, many of them in duels against German snipers. Janina wrote in her diary of stalking an enemy marksman across the broken remains of a village. For 2 days she tracked him, never revealing herself. Finally, when the German shifted to take a shot at one of her comrades, Janina fired first. She logged the kill in her notebook with quiet precision. Her comrades admired her ferocity. German soldiers feared her reputation, whispered from trench to trench, "The girl sniper who never misses." But Janina was not alone. Nina Lobkovskaya, who had survived Stalingrad, now commanded an entire platoon of female snipers. By 1944, her unit was deployed near the front during the push into Belarus. Each of her women carried a Mosin Nagant with PU scope, and each had been drilled in patience, endurance, and stealth. Their orders were not just to harass German infantry, but to systematically target officers, artillery observers, and machine gun crews, the backbone of any German defence. Lobkovskaya's platoon operated as hunters. They moved in pairs, one shooter, one spotter. They set up before dawn, crawled into no man's land, and waited. If they were discovered, they melted back into the forest. If not, by nightfall there would be fresh entries in their notebooks, and the Germans would sleep with one fewer officer to guide them. German sniper units soon realized they were facing equals, if not superiors. The duels grew more personal. A German would bait his Soviet counterpart by exposing a helmet or a decoy rifle. Soviet women countered with their own tricks, using mirrors, dummies, or deliberately leaving trails to lure Germans into an ambush. One Soviet report from 1943 tells of a woman sniper who noticed a German sharpshooter repeatedly firing from a ruined house. Instead of shooting immediately, she watched patiently. When the German grew confident, she marked his firing rhythm. On his next shot, before he could reload, she put a round through the same window. When her comrades entered the house later, they found him slumped at his post, his scope shattered by her bullet. The Germans, who once mocked the idea of women in uniform, now developed a grim respect. Their field manuals began warning soldiers about the Russian female sharpshooters, advising them never to underestimate their patience or skill. Some German officers went so far as to call them the invisible witches of the steppe. The psychological toll was enormous. German soldiers wrote home of their terror at raising their heads above trenches, knowing a Soviet woman might be watching. One diary entry found on a fallen soldier read, "They say she is a girl, but she is death itself." We hear the crack, and another comrade falls. There is no laughter any more when we speak of Russian women. For the women themselves, the duels were intimate and exhausting. Killing at long distance was not anonymous, it was deeply personal. Each German they killed was someone they had studied for hours, sometimes days, learning his habits, watching him eat, smoke, or rest. The final shot was not just a victory, but the culmination of a long hunt. Janina wrote in her diary that she often felt sorrow after killing. "I know he had a mother too," she confessed. Yet she also wrote that her duty to the motherland outweighed her emotions. By late 1943 and into 1944, Soviet women snipers had become a vital tool of the Red Army. More than 2,000 served across the front, and their combined kill counts numbered in the tens of thousands. Some, like Ludmila Pavlichenko, hailed as the Lady Death with 309 confirmed kills, became international symbols. She toured the United States in 1942, standing beside Eleanor Roosevelt, a living rebuke to those who doubted women's place in war. But the greatest impact was not in parades or propaganda. It was in the trenches, in the forests, in the ruined villages where German soldiers hesitated to peek above a wall. That hesitation, that moment of fear, slowed their advance and cost them lives. As the Red Army pushed westward, the sniper duels continued. Janina would meet her fate in East Prussia in 1945, killed at the age of just 20, her diary found with her body. Lobkovskaya survived the war, honoured for her leadership. Pavlichenko too lived, carrying her legend into peacetime. The Germans had once scoffed at the notion of women in battle, but by 1945, when the ruins of Berlin echoed with the crack of Soviet rifles, they knew the truth. These women were not an anomaly. They were soldiers, hunters, and avengers. The duels had proven it beyond doubt. In the end, the German response had come too late. Their counter-snipers had been bested, their morale undermined, and their pride shattered. The women of the Red Army had not only fought, they had redefined what was possible on the battlefield. The rifle in their hands was more than a weapon. It was justice, it was vengeance. And in the smoking ruins of the Eastern Front, it was the sound of history being rewritten, one shot at a time. The war's end in May 1945 did not silence the echoes of the Soviet women snipers. For those who had survived, victory brought not only relief, but also a reckoning. They had proved themselves as soldiers, hunters, and protectors of their homeland. Yet the transition from the battlefield back into civilian life was anything but simple. The Soviet Union celebrated its victory with parades in Moscow, banners draped across Red Square, and proclamations of gratitude for the sacrifices of its people. Among the thousands of honoured veterans were women, many wearing the sniper's badge with pride. Yet the spotlight was not evenly shared. For every Ludmila Pavlichenko, whose reputation as Lady Death had spread across the world, there were hundreds of others, anonymous, unmentioned, their stories buried beneath the rubble of war. Official Soviet records note that roughly 2,484 women served as trained snipers, with a combined tally of more than 11,000 confirmed kills. Their units were often disbanded quietly after the war, their members reassigned or released into civilian life. Some were awarded medals, others faded into obscurity. Many carried their rifles one last time during victory marches before returning to towns and villages where their wartime deeds seemed almost unreal. The psychological scars were deep. Rosa Shanina's diary, recovered after her death in East Prussia, captured the paradox of their existence. Pride in service, but sorrow at the human cost. "I cannot forget his face," she had written of one German soldier she killed. Survivors often shared similar sentiments. Killing from a distance was not faceless, it was deliberate, personal, and haunting. In post-war interrogations, captured German officers admitted that the women had been among their most feared enemies. Some Wehrmacht veterans later recalled that encountering Soviet women snipers had shaken their belief in inevitable German superiority. "They did not tire, they did not forgive," one officer said in a 1946 interview. "They were the shadow of death." Yet back home, these women returned to societies eager to restore traditional gender roles. Many faced a quiet dismissal of their wartime identity. Some were discouraged from speaking of their kills. Marriage, motherhood, and labour became the expected path, and stories of women in combat were often treated as exceptional curiosities rather than a fundamental part of the Red Army's success. Still, memory persisted. Veterans' reunions in the 1950s and 1960s sometimes featured gatherings of former sniper units, where women swapped stories over tea and vodka. The bond forged in war was unbreakable. In those circles, they were not housewives or labourers. They were soldiers, remembering the hunts they had shared, the duels they had survived, and the comrades they had lost. International recognition was uneven. Pavlichenko, who had toured the United States during the war, became the most famous, immortalized in songs, books, and interviews. Eleanor Roosevelt called her a symbol of courage. But others, like Nina Lobkovskaya, remained lesser known, their achievements celebrated only in specialist histories or military academies. The Germans, too, carried memories of these encounters into the post-war years. At the 1962 US-Japanese-Soviet Aviation and Ground Combat Symposium, former German officers described the women as fanatical, skilled, and disciplined. One Wehrmacht veteran confessed that the knowledge of women hunters watching them had been worse than artillery. The Red Army's reliance on women snipers also influenced later debates on gender and combat roles. In Cold War military circles, the Soviet experience was often cited as proof that women could excel in direct combat. Western militaries, however, were slower to adapt, and for decades the idea remained controversial. By the late 20th century, with memoirs published and oral histories recorded, the legacy of these women began to take its rightful place in the story of the Second World War. Books, documentaries, and museum exhibits highlighted their precision, their endurance, and their impact on the battlefield. At a 1985 Pacific and Eastern Front veterans reunion in Hawaii, former American airmen who had fought in Europe listened as Soviet veterans spoke of their women snipers. The Americans, surprised, asked whether it had been propaganda. The Soviet veterans simply shook their heads. "No," one replied. "They were real, and they were better than many men." In modern Russia, statues and plaques now commemorate their service. Schoolchildren learn the names Pavlichenko, Shanina, and Lobkovskaya, alongside those of Zhukov and Rokossovsky. Yet for every named heroine, thousands more remain faceless in memory, their kills recorded only in dusty archives or forgotten logbooks. Perhaps the greatest legacy lies not in numbers or medals, but in the transformation of perception. In 1941, German soldiers had laughed at the idea of women in combat. By 1945, they feared them. That change, born of blood, sacrifice, and relentless precision, was irreversible. The Soviet women snipers proved that skill, courage, and endurance were not bound by gender. They rewrote the rules of war in the ruins of Stalingrad, the forests of Belarus, and the fields of East Prussia. Their rifles, silent now, still echo in history. They were not just soldiers. They were pioneers, symbols of resilience, and reminders that in humanity's darkest hours, courage wears many faces. And for the German soldiers who once mocked them, those faces were the last they never saw. Writing history has a way of softening edges, of turning brutal reality into cleaner stories. But the legacy of the Soviet women snipers cannot be smoothed into legend without acknowledging the contradictions and burdens they carried. They were celebrated as heroes, used as propaganda symbols, and yet too often forgotten as individuals. Their rifles are silent now, but their impact lingers across battlefields, across generations, and across debates about what it means to fight, to endure, and to be remembered. In the Soviet Union of the late 1940s and 1950s, official commemoration focused on grand marshals and tank battles. The snipers, especially the women, were often left in the margins. Some lived quietly, raising families and blending into civilian anonymity. Others continued to serve in the military or in party positions, though rarely at the forefront. Many did not speak of their war years, not because they were ashamed, but because their memories were too sharp, too heavy. For those who had logged dozens of kills, the battlefield did not vanish when the guns fell silent. Faces stayed with them. Diaries, like Rosa Shanina's, testified to the emotional weight of each shot. Yet their absence from mainstream Soviet mythology did not erase them. In specialist military schools, the stories of Pavlichenko, Shanina, and Lobkovskaya became case studies in patience, camouflage, and precision. Their tactics were dissected by cadets. Their endurance was used to inspire new generations of sharpshooters. Though their fame was muted, their influence shaped doctrine. Beyond the Soviet Union, their presence influenced broader debates about gender and combat. Western militaries, particularly the United States and Britain, viewed the Red Army's women as anomalies rather than models. But in the 1970s and 1980s, as women increasingly pressed for equal roles in their own armed forces, Historians and advocates pointed to the Soviet example. Thousands of women, many in their teens and early 20s, had not only fought but excelled in the most demanding combat role of all. Their service undermined the argument that women were unsuited for frontline duty. The psychological effect on the Germans lingered as well. Wehrmacht memoirs, published in West Germany in the 1950s and 1960s, often included passages of disbelief at the sight of women with rifles. Officers admitted that the shock of realizing a deadly sniper was a young woman gnawed at their morale. The dismissive laughter of 1941 had turned into grim recognition by 1943. For those who survived the Eastern Front, the memory of the Russische Scharfschützinnen was indelible. By the time of the 1962 Joint History Symposium in Tokyo, former German, Soviet and Japanese officers sat in the same rooms discussing the war. Accounts of Soviet women snipers were not dismissed as propaganda, but treated as case studies in effective morale warfare. One German colonel, retired now, spoke candidly. Our men could not understand how the same women who should have been at home raising children were instead in the rubble of Stalingrad, killing them one by one. It broke something inside them. That breaking of stereotypes, of arrogance, of certainty, may be the deepest legacy of all. The Cold War years turned their stories into both inspiration and tool. Soviet films dramatized women snipers as symbols of patriotic devotion. In the West, their tales circulated in niche histories and veterans' memoirs, often colored with awe. The feminist movements of the late 20th century seized upon their records to argue for women's capability in military service. When debates flared in Washington or London about whether women should be allowed in combat roles, the example of Pavlichenko's 309 confirmed kills or Shanina's lethal duels appeared in essays and reports. By the late 20th century, museums in Moscow, Kiev and Minsk displayed the rifles, uniforms and logbooks of these women. School children visited exhibits, reading plaques about the silent huntresses of the motherland. The legacy became not only about tactics or numbers, but about national pride. Russia, Belarus and Ukraine each claimed part of their story. Still, the deeper truth lay in the silence that followed the war. Many of these women never told their children the full story. Some left diaries that were published only after their deaths. The weight of being both hunter and survivor was not easily spoken. In that silence is another lesson, that courage does not always mean pride, and that service can leave wounds that medals cannot heal. Today their legacy extends beyond history books. Modern Russian and Ukrainian snipers, male and female, still invoke their names in training halls. Their strategies are studied, their resilience admired. In 21st century conflicts, when debates arise about whether women can endure the pressures of combat, the Eastern Front provides its rebuttal. They already did, in the most brutal war of all. The German soldiers of 1941 never expected their most feared opponents would be young women with rifles. They never imagined that laughter would turn to dread, or that diaries written in cramped huts would one day testify to their defeat. Yet that is precisely what happened. The rifles of Pavlichenko, Shanina, Lobkovskaya, and thousands more now rest in museums or in forgotten attics. Their scopes are clouded, their stocks scarred. But their story remains sharp. They proved that the battlefield knows no gender, that precision, patience, and willpower can overcome expectation. The Eastern Front consumed millions of lives and left Europe scarred. But within that vast tragedy, the story of the Soviet women snipers stands as something more than a footnote. It is a challenge to assumptions, a reminder of resilience, and a testament to the ways history is rewritten not by myth, but by the quiet crack of a rifle in the ruins. Their shots still echo, not as sounds of death, but as voices of history whispering that courage wears many faces, and that even in war's darkest night, defiance can shine. When the last shots of 1945 faded and the world entered a fragile peace, the Soviet women snipers returned home, or what was left of it. Cities lay in ruins, families shattered, futures uncertain. The rifles that had defined their youth were locked away, placed in museums, or buried in closets, their steel-cold reminders of years that could never be forgotten. The Soviet Union celebrated victory with grand parades in Red Square, banners proclaiming the indomitable will of the motherland. Yet behind the official triumph, the echoes of war whispered quietly through the lives of those who had once lived behind the crosshairs. For many, homecoming was as disorienting as the battlefield had been. Lyudmila Pavlichenko, the famed Lady Death, returned as a decorated hero, her name spoken with reverence in the Soviet press. She had stood on American stages, met Eleanor Roosevelt, and been paraded as proof of Soviet resilience. But heroism carried its own burden. Pavlichenko never fully escaped the shadow of her 309 confirmed kills. She worked as a historian, wrote, lectured, and smiled for photographs, but in quiet hours, the weight of those years pressed heavily. She had survived, but she had also lived a life few could understand. Others did not enjoy such recognition. Rosa Shanina's story ended before the war did. Her diary, poetic, raw, haunted, was discovered after her death and published posthumously. For a generation raised on rigid Soviet propaganda, Shanina's words offered something startling: vulnerability. She had admitted fear, loneliness, even doubt. Her diary revealed that heroism was not unshakable steel, but flesh and blood, quivering yet determined. Soviet authorities were uneasy with her humanity, but her memory lived on in whispered admiration among fellow veterans and in the quiet inspiration of future readers. Thousands of women who had fought as snipers, partisans, and infantry simply slipped back into anonymity. They became teachers, nurses, clerks, mothers. Their neighbours knew them as ordinary women, rarely suspecting that the quiet lady tending a garden had once stalked Wehrmacht soldiers through the ruins of Smolensk or the forests of Belarus. For these women, silence was not just choice, but necessity. The Soviet Union, eager to move forward, did not always encourage talk of the war's rawest wounds. The medals gathered dust in drawers. The memories remained sharp. Yet even silence carries its own resonance. Children grew up sensing their mother's toughness, their resilience, even if the stories were left untold. Some only learned of their mother's service decades later, piecing together fragments from faded photographs, military documents, or comrades' letters. The absence of stories became its own kind of story, a testimony to the things too heavy to put into words. Meanwhile, in Germany, the memory of facing female snipers lingered like a phantom. Veterans' associations published memoirs that admitted the shock of discovering that the deadly marksman in the rubble was a young woman. Some recounted bitter frustration at being hunted by opponents they had once dismissed as inferior. The laughter of 1941 had curdled into respect, and sometimes even a grim admiration. They knew, better than most, that Soviet women had not been propaganda fantasies, they had been real and lethal. The Cold War froze those legacies in place. Soviet propaganda exalted the women when useful, presenting them as symbols of the indomitable socialist spirit. Yet the full humanity of their experience, grief, psychological scars, the loneliness of memory, was rarely spoken of publicly. Western accounts, too, often stripped them of complexity, turning them into legends rather than people. In both East and West, the women themselves remained trapped between myth and silence. But history has a way of circling back. In the late 20th century, as the Soviet Union crumbled and archives opened, scholars and journalists began to dig deeper. Diaries, letters, and testimonies emerged, painting a fuller picture. The Soviet women snipers were not just symbols of patriotic devotion. They were young women who carried immense burdens. They endured hunger, frostbite, exhaustion, and the psychological toll of killing. They laughed, loved, wrote poetry, and sometimes wept between missions. They were both extraordinary and human, their resilience forged in fire but never free of its scars, their legacy stretched beyond borders. In debates across the world about women in the military, the Soviet example became a touchstone. When skeptics argued that women could not endure the demands of combat, advocates pointed to Pavlichenko, Shanina, and thousands more who had proven otherwise under the harshest conditions imaginable. Their service undermined stereotypes, not with theory, but with lived reality. In Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine today, monuments stand in their honor. Museums display their rifles, their uniforms, their medals. School children learn their names alongside the great tank battles and generals. Yet the truest memorials are not the statues, but the lives they touched, the soldiers they saved by eliminating enemy scouts, the comrades they inspired with calm precision, the generations they proved wrong simply by existing. Still, the echoes remain uneasy. War extracts a price, even from its victors. Many of these women lived with what modern psychology would call trauma. In letters and diaries, one finds confessions of recurring dreams, of guilt, of the faces of the fallen lingering in memory. Some found solace in silence, others in writing, others in sharing only with fellow veterans who could understand. The Soviet state may have glorified their service, but it rarely offered the care their wounds demanded. And yet, despite the silence, their rifles spoke across time. Every shot fired in those years reshaped not only the battlefield, but the story of women in war. Each kill, each survival, each diary entry was an assertion that war was not solely a man's realm, that courage was not limited by gender. Today, when modern conflicts again test the boundaries of who fights and why, the memory of the Soviet women snipers is invoked as both inspiration and caution. They remind us that necessity can shatter convention, that resilience can emerge from unexpected places, but also that the cost of such service is borne in silence long after the parade's end. The silent echoes of their war remain in diaries tucked in archives, in photographs yellowed with age, in rifles displayed under glass. But most of all, they remain in the knowledge that history's assumptions were once shattered by young women in winter coats, hidden in rubble, steadying their breathing as they looked through a scope. Their war is over, their rifles are still. But their legacy continues to whisper, of resilience, of defiance, of the human capacity to endure and to fight, even when the world insists you cannot. The Soviet women snipers of World War II shattered every expectation, proving that courage knew no gender. Some, like Lyudmila Pavlichenko, became legends. Others, like Rosa Shanina, left only diaries and memories. Most slipped quietly back into ordinary life, their stories hidden behind silence. Yet their legacy endures, in monuments, in faded letters, in the knowledge that when war demanded the impossible, they answered. Their rifles may be still, but their courage continues to echo, reminding us that resilience, once revealed, can never be forgotten.